Selalu kita, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, Bapak Ibu sekalian yang berbahagia, Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh, salam sejahtera bagi kita semua. I'm very delighted today to chair, joining us today, no need introduction speakers. We have here, he is Professor of Economics at Harvard University. He served as Chief Economist at the IMF from 2001 to 2003. He is one of the best-selling authors in macroeconomics. I proudly present joining us today from Cambridge, Professor Kenneth Rogoff. Our second speaker, he is Professor of Economics at Peking University. He is one of behind the scene of the new structural economics, the success of the Chinese modern economy. Joining us from Peking, he served as Senior Vice President of the World Bank from 2008 to 2012. Joining us from Beijing, Professor Justin Yifulin.
Thank you.
Our third speaker, my idol, she's been always the front runner defending for the rights for developing countries. She is professor at Jawaharlal Nehru University and Amherst, Massachusetts University. She is the UN Secretary General High Level Advisory Board. Joining us today from New Delhi, Professor Jayati Ghosh. The last but the most awaited one, of course, I can see everybody here says my best friends, my mentor. His latest books on COVID-19 in Indonesia is the most read book at Routledge. He served as the Minister of Finance of Indonesia from 2013 to 2014, one of the best Indonesian economists. Please welcome joining us, Dr. Muhammad Khatib Basri. We are currently facing very challenging situations. The world economy is expected to grow at 2.3 to 2.8% in the best scenario. And we are also facing some very aggressive interest rates increases in the last 6 months, as well as the inflations. What will be the global economic this year, next year, and the next 5 years? Let me invite first each speakers to provide the opening statements, starting with Professor Rogoff. Please, Ken.
Thank you very much. It's an incredible honor to speak here, President Widodo, ministers, this tremendous panel that you've put together, representatives, esteemed audience. I can only say I really wish I was there in person, and I look forward to that on another occasion. I'm afraid I don't have a very cheery message to deliver. There are darkening clouds over the global economy, and as the managing director of the IMF said, I think rightly, the worst is yet to come. Starting with Europe, their situation is probably the most difficult because they're at the edge of the war between Russia and Ukraine. They are obviously cut off from energy. They're facing very high inflation from food prices, from energy prices. Investment is low because there's tremendous uncertainty about what's coming next. Europe will almost certainly have a recession, probably a long-lasting one, and that's probably in the good scenario. I think it could be worse. It's very difficult for the policymakers because they're facing these very negative real shocks. There's no easy solution with demand. Of course, we have my friend Justin Lin is going to speak about China, but I will only say that China, having provided more than 25% of the world's growth over the preceding 10 to 15 years, is in a very slow period. And what for China, it's not maybe technically a recession, but is much slower than usual for many reasons. But real estate certainly is one of the reasons. But then let me come to the United States, where we have very high inflation. That's partly our fault. We're also facing some of the supply shocks, but I don't think there's any question that policies erred. There was too much stimulus, interest rates were held too low too long, and now there's moving furiously, at least the central bank, in the other direction. And I don't know when it's going to stop. I think there's a serious chance that in trying to engineer a softish landing, according to the Fed chair, things could be much worse. I'll just say it's very hard to precisely land the economy to slow inflation because monetary policy has effects a year, 2 years from now. So they're putting on the brakes and they don't really know what's happening. It is remarkable in this period of slowing growth and rising US interest rates and a soaring US dollar, the highest surge in the real dollar since 2002. You have to go back to 1985 to see a surge in the dollar like this. It's remarkable there has not been more stress on the global economy. There have been tremendous problems in poor developing economies coming back from the pandemic. There are some larger emerging markets, Pakistan notably, Nigeria, possibly Kenya, that are all running into trouble, although the largest emerging markets have not yet done so. Southern Asia, and Indonesia in particular, is a relative bright spot. You've just heard many comments about resilience. Inflation is lower in Asia in general. Certainly a country like Indonesia is benefiting from the higher commodity prices. But actually, you can go across Southern Asia looking at Malaysia, Singapore, we'll hear about India later, are a relative bright spot in the global economy. I just say further that I think one of the reasons for that in Indonesia, it has developed a more resilient policy framework. If I was still at the IMF, I would be saying, but you have to do better. But I'm not still at the IMF. And I would say, I think Indonesia's done pretty well. The changes that have been made since the taper tantrum in 2014, but I'm sure it's a challenge to maintain that. What can happen ahead? Well, the recession is certainly going to be felt, even in the south of Asia. The dollar probably over the long run is going to come down a lot. Whenever it's gone up this much, it's come down. But before then, it can go up more. Interest rates can rise more than you think. The dollar can go up. And then I think that could be quite a stress test. Finally, over the longer term, I would caution that even when inflation in Europe and the United States come down, interest rates will stay higher than you're used to for a long, long time. The world has become used to these very low interest rates after the financial crisis, where interest rates have fallen even more than inflation fell. That has come to an end. The whole idea that that was secular, that would go on forever was, I think, always misguided. And I would say the era of free lunches that many people saw is over. I think it's going to be a very difficult adjustment for the advanced economies to get used to the fact that debt is not going to be so cheap. Thank you.
Thank you, Ken. That's very interesting indeed to learn how major economies are doing right now. Let's hear insights. How about the Chinese economy? Please, Justin.
Okay, thank you very much. It's a great pleasure for me to share with you about my view relating to China's growth. The growth in China is important for China itself because China wants to get out of the middle income trap and to become a high income country. Certainly, growth in China is also important for the world. As Ken just mentioned, in the past 14 years, each year, China contributed about a quarter to a third to the global growth. But this year, the growth is under pressure. For the government's goal of this year was to have 5.5% growth. But the first half of this year, the growth rate was only 2.5%. And now we are approaching the end of the year. I think the best that China can do this year is around 3%. And this will be one of the lowest growth rate in China since 1978. It will be a little bit higher than 2020. That year, it was 2.1%. And this year, around 3%. And the reason for this disappointing growth rate, certainly I think most of you already understand the main reasons. The first one is the outbreak of Omicron and China's policy of zero COVID. And that caused the lockdowns in many parts of the city for extended period of time and then sometimes repeated. And this kind of lockdown certainly disrupt production and suppress consumption. And secondly, also Ken already mentioned, China's policy towards real estate sectors. The government's goal is to avoid big bubbles in real estate. Certainly, this policy is good for the long run, but in the short run, it will replace investment and so on, and certainly will have negative impact on growth. And also rising interest rate in the US causing outflow of capital, and the war between Russia and Ukraine causing the rising oil prices and so on. Those things all put pressure on the growth in China. So this year, we cannot be optimistic. How about next year? I think we can be more optimistic. I think there's a chance. The growth in China next year may bounce back to 8% or even more. I think the main reason, one, there must be some adjustment about the policy towards COVID-19. Because when the new variant become less lethal, and also the vaccination rate will increase, especially for the vulnerable group like aging people, the vaccination rate will increase. And certainly medically, China will also more prepared to cope with the outbreak and so on. And secondly, more important, I think that China has strengths in maintaining high growth. One thing is that China is still in the catching up stage. There's huge room for growth. And secondly, China has many resources for investment. The saving rate is high, around 45% of GDP, and the government fiscal space is also quite strong. And so there are many resources China can mobilize for investment. And equally important is the will of the Chinese government to maintain growth. The Chinese government understands growth is the foundation to cope with any challenges domestically and internationally. And so because 2022, there's such a low growth. And so due to the low base effect, I think next year in China, the growth rate will be around 8% or even more. And certainly, it's more important to look some kind of medium-term horizon, let's say up to 2025 or even up to 2030. I think there's a possibility for China to maintain annually about 5% to 6% growth. If there's no global shocks like another round of pandemic or global financial crisis. My confidence is based on the following factors. The first one is growth potential. Currently, the per capita GDP measured by purchasing power parity in China is around 25 to 30% of the US. And it's similar to Germany in 1950s, Japan in 1960s, and Korea in 1980s. And all those three countries, they maintain more than 8% annual growth rate for more than 10 years on a similar level of country up. And because of that, I think there's a potential growth rate for China to be around 8% for the coming decade. And secondly, is the fourth industrial revolution. The fourth industrial revolution, especially in the area like digital economy or artificial intelligence. We know those kind of new technology, they have the characteristics of short innovation cycle, 12 months, 18 months, a new generation of technology. And the investment, the R&D in this new economies, the most important input is human capital, talents. And China has 1.4 billion population. Certainly, China has abundant supply of human capital, talents. And secondly, China also has a large domestic economy. If you measure by purchasing power parity, China is already the largest economy in the world. And for the new economy, if they need to have hardware, and China has the most complete manufacturing sectors in the world. And all those leading to China has competitive edge in the new economy. And China also has abundant resources for investment, as I said. The saving rate will continue to be around 45% of GDP. And the Chinese government fiscal space actually, is quite strong because central government's debt is only about 20% of China's GDP. Local government's debt a little bit higher, about 40% of China's GDP. And the debt in China are all in local currencies. And so there's a room for China to mobilize resources to tap into that growth potential. And as I said, there's a will in China to maintain growth. So for that, I think that if you look at more longer horizon, the average annual growth rate in China can be 5 to 6% in the coming 5 or even 10 years. So I like the theme of this summit, to maintain optimism in uncertainty. And I think for the longer term, we can have optimism about China's economy in spite the uncertainty in the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Justin. It's quite comforting to learn how optimistic Chinese economy, setting the target of 5 to 6% this year and even 8% next year, because the Indonesian's economy is highly related, particularly on trade and investments to Chinese economy. So it's really good news for businesses joining us today and to businesses in Indonesia. Let us invite the third speakers. What do you think about the Indian and other developing countries' economies? Please, Jayati.
Thank you so much, Lily. And it is really a great honor and a privilege to be in such an eminent group and with this excellent discussion. So I'm, in a sense, I'm sorry to be following Justin because, he was so optimistic and especially about China. And I think a lot of that is justified. And I really do believe what he's saying about China. Unfortunately, I cannot say the same for most other low and middle income countries. In fact, I'm now not even sure I should call all of them developing because we don't know whether they are developing in the same way anymore or whether they're emerging or actually currently just submerged. So in a sense, I'm going to be even more pessimistic than Professor Rogoff about the conditions for most low and middle income countries, because I think the term perfect storm was mentioned earlier in the morning, and we are facing a perfect storm. There's no doubt about it. The food crisis, the fuel crisis, the debt crisis, the climate crisis, all of these coming at one blow, in fact, all around us. And we are now facing the very, very large spillover effects of monetary policy in the advanced economies that Professor Rogoff already mentioned. The fact that this raising interest rates, the biggest coordinated rise in interest rates in the last half century, which is happening much more rapidly than it has ever happened before. And we are facing the fallout because we are getting capital flight, we're getting a major erosion of our reserves in the attempt to protect our currencies. The Indian reserves have fallen by more than 80 billion in just 3 months. So clearly there is a huge impact that is going to be felt, and we don't anymore have the tools that we should have to deal with them. And we certainly don't have the tools available to the advanced economies, because if we do any of the things that advanced economies do, we face capital flight and further crises. Again, China is a huge exception in this, and I think Justin is absolutely right in being more optimistic for China's prospects for many, many different reasons. But we know that China is a huge outlier. In terms of India, I would also like to emphasize that India brings out one second aspect of what is happening in many low and middle income countries, which is not talked about as much, which is inequality. We've had a very dramatic increase in inequality after a time when everybody said that global inequalities have reached, their peak. And after they had reached their peak, we have seen a dramatic increase in inequality during the pandemic and then very much after the Ukraine war, where a lot of the increase in prices we now know, it was not necessarily because of supply shocks of the war, but because of profiteering by large food and fuel companies and subsequently financial speculation, particularly in the March to May period in commodities markets, which is why now the commodity markets prices have come down to pre-war levels. But we are still facing higher prices because all our currencies have depreciated in the interim. Now, in India, we supposedly have a reasonably resilient economy. That's what our finance minister certainly says. It's resilient for the top 10%. Our increase in GDP is now disproportionately concentrated at the top. We have a major livelihoods crisis, and we have had this even before the pandemic. The pandemic obviously made it significantly worse, but we now have 50% of the population with lower money wages than they had before the pandemic. Lower money wages. So imagine what has happened to real wages in that period. So we have experiencing very significant increases in hunger, dramatic drops in employment rates, a worsening of the wages underemployment, significant losses in the incomes of the self-employed, who are about half of our workforce. And so, yes, there is some degree of recovery in aggregate GDP, but very little of that is filtering down to the conditions of most of the population. So that in a sense, 70% of our population at least is actually in a much more, fragile and vulnerable condition than they were 5 years ago. And they are actually facing material losses in terms of their ability to consume even basic needs. this is not a viable situation for an economy. And of course, it's not desirable for many reasons, but it also means that we shouldn't be looking just at the aggregate growth or the per capita growth even, because it is so highly concentrated. And that leads to all kinds of unpleasant social and political outcomes, but also it leads to a poor economic outcome, because it means that the mass market for goods does not grow. And it therefore means that investment does not take off in the ways that are desired. And it therefore means that policies designed to encourage investment, supply side policies like lowering tax rates, which happened for us in 2019, a very major reduction in corporate tax rates, do not have the desired effect of increasing investment. So until we resolve this, until we somehow ensure that we have sufficient fiscal space that actually delivers better conditions in terms of social protection, adequate access to food, to health, to basic education, and so on for most of our population, we will not get the mass market that is required to make investments happen in our own economies. And I think this is extreme in India. It's very marked in India, but India is not alone. There are many low and middle income countries facing this problem. The internal difficulty, if you like, the problem of the internal inequality that is generating a particular distribution, adding to the problems of, the global perfect storm, the multiple crises that we face. Let me stop on that very depressing note, but we'll have a discussion, I'm sure. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jayati, for sharing some of precautions that we have to think and consider. Let me now invite Dr. Khatib Basris on the Indonesian economies, please.
Thank you very much, Lily. Please allow me to speak in both in English and also in Bahasa Indonesia, because all of the audience here are Indonesian basically. So let me follow up what has been discussed by Ken, by Justin, and Jayati regarding the uncertainty in the global economy. Then the question is, what will be the implication to the Indonesian economy? The way I look at the situation, that the impact may come to two channels. The first channels will be the trade channel. When we listen to Ken, to Jayati and Justin about the, especially Ken, about the possibility of the slowdown of the global economy. So like it or not, there will be a negative repercussion effect to our trade. Yeah, but listening to Justin, that the situation in China not as bad as what we thought. And China is one of the most important trading partner for Indonesia. So somehow I can see maybe the impact to the Indonesian economy, to trade channel, will be limited. And in addition to that, we are lucky, Lily, I should use this word, because, well, the Minister of Trade, former Minister of Trade is here, Pak Enggar. Our share of export to GDP is relatively small compared to country like Singapore or Malaysia. Yeah, I can imagine that the global shock will have the negative impact to significantly impacted country like Singapore, because the share of the trade to GDP is more than 200%. But in the case of Indonesia, our export to GDP is around 25%. So I recall back on 2008, when we survived the global financial crisis, I wrote a piece, I call it as one of the reasons why we survived the global financial crisis, for two reasons: good policy response and good luck. And I think the similar situation will be repeated again. Yeah, because the share of export to GDP is relatively small. The second issue is, with the geopolitical tension, winter is coming in Europe, and there will be a strong demand for energy, especially for, for heating system in Germany. So perhaps they will shift the demand for electricity by demanding coal. And that's explained why the coal price remains high, despite the slowdown, the declining price of oil or the palm oil. As an implication, somehow, the effect for the trade, even though our trade will slow down, but will be relatively limited. Now let me move to the second channel, through the financial channel. I am more concerned on this channel. Why? Because, correct me if I'm wrong, Ken, I would like to hear your view on this. There is a possibility of the strong dollar in the future for several reasons. It's perhaps maybe because the differential growth between US and Europe. The second one, US is now a net exporter for commodity and also energy. So I believe that the terms of trade will be relatively strong as well. Yeah. So with that, the implication for Indonesia is the first one, they may come through the balance sheet effect. Because for some companies who borrow in the US dollar, there will be a contractionary impact on that. And then foreign direct investment, they focus on the domestic market, the revenue in the rupiah, but the profit repatriation will be in the US dollar. There will be a sort of like, repercussion balance sheet effect as well. That's the first one. The second one, if you look at the inflation in Indonesia is rising now. So like it or not, the central bank need to raise the interest rate. If you look at the producer price index, now it's around 9%, but on the consumer side, it's around 5%. So I can imagine somehow this producer need to pass on this cost of goods sold to the consumer. So Bank Indonesia will do the tightening. Yeah, this will hit the economy. Then the next question is, what can be done through the fiscal side? Since all of the three speakers are professors in economics, I remember there's one sort of like a prescription in economics that if you are facing a sort of like a slowdown of the economy and the current account surplus is also declining, one of the policy prescription is to use the fiscal expansion and combine with this tightening monetary policy to ensure the internal and external balance. But unfortunately, our situation is not good as what we expected. Why? Because next year the government said the budget deficit will be less than 3%. So the implication is with the slowdown of the global economy, declining some commodity price, it will reduce the tax revenue. But at the same time, the government try to set the budget deficit lower than the 3%. So the implication is we will see the fiscal contractionary by 2023. So the combination of the contraction in both monetary policy and also the fiscal policy somehow will drag down the economic growth for next year. So I would say, looking from this perspective, if your question is whether Indonesia will enter the recession or not, my answer is no. But the Indonesian economy will slow down. And some companies need to prepare for the impact of this contractionary through the balance sheet. Yeah. What about the exchange rate? Every time economists, make a prediction about exchange rate, it just shows that they have sense of humor because we will be wrong anyway. No one can predict the exchange rate. But the implication is we need to look at our balance sheet. So in short, I would like, before I conclude my remarks, Lily, how do I describe about Indonesia at this moment? I called Indonesia is maybe one of the few of the least unattractive countries in the world. Not because we are doing great, but because the other part of the world are in trouble. I stop it here. Thank you very much.
Bapak Ibu sekalian, pertanyaan juga dapat disampaikan melalui WhatsApp dalam bahasa Indonesia. Let us start our discussions today. Ken, if we may start from you, this is questions from businesses. What is your thought on aggressive increases in interest rates in developing countries? And just in this semester, this year, capital flows from developing countries recorded $50 billion US. What will be your seeing in the near future, and how would you advise developing countries to respond to these aggressive interest rates? Please, Ken.
Well, I think Chachi said it very well that if the U.S. interest rates keep rising and particularly if the dollar keeps appreciating, it's going to be a very difficult choice. That'll create inflation. If you raise interest rate, you have to start raising interest rates, but it's going to be very difficult for the economies. So, certainly there's no easy answer to that question. I think it's a very challenging situation. I actually think myself, I think I'm in a minority of U.S. economists, that the Federal Reserve is being too aggressive, that lowering inflation is important, but it's not the be-all and end-all of economic policy. Once we get it down to 3 or 4%, say 3.5 or 4%, I would favor slowing things down. But I think if we don't, it's going to be a mess.
Ken, we can hear you. Do you want to continue?
No, I'm sorry. I had intended, I'm trying to leave time for other questions. So I had intended to stop. There's much more to say, of course, but I was going to leave room for other speakers.
Okay, while we are working on the technical issues, the second question is coming from the property associations from Indonesia. It says, this question's to Justin. Despite the Chinese magnificent economic transformations, one of the main concerns is China's high ratio of debt to GDP, including local government's debt, and also the housing bubble. What will be your observations on these issues, and what do you see the Chinese governments will handle these issues? Please, Justin.
Thank you very much. Certainly, debt can always be an issue, so we need to pay attention to. However, as I said, the public debt in China actually is not high, especially compared to other countries. The central government debt is about 20% of China's GDP. Local government's debt around 40% of China's GDP. And also, the government debt are used for investment in infrastructure and so on. So those investments certainly will build up assets. So if you look at net debt of the Chinese government, no matter central or local, actually it's much lower than what it appeared to be. And third, almost all the debts in China are in local currencies. There can be an issue when it's denominated in foreign currencies. And so for that, I do feel comfortable. But there's one problem about Chinese government debt. That is the local government debt has some kind of term mismatch. Because the local government, according to Chinese fiscal regulation, they cannot have deficit. They have to balance their budget every year. But there's need for them to make investment, especially during the counter-cyclical interventions. So the local government set up so-called investment vehicles, and they borrow money from the commercial bank for short-run debts to make an investment in infrastructure that's long-term. So there's some kind of term mismatch. And so causing the worry about whether the governments, the local governments, have the ability to repay those kind of short-term debt timely. And so the way to address the issue certainly is to revise our fiscal policies. And currently, the arrangement was that, we need to make the long-term investment and supported by long-term debt. And now, in the transition period, the central government issue bonds on behalf of the local government to support those kind of long-term investment or to retire from the short-term debt. That is some kind of temporary measure. But I think that the better way in the future certainly is to modify China's fiscal regulation, allow the local governments to issue bonds when they are needed, and allow the local governments to have deficit, and they don't have to balance the budget every year. So let me stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Justin. That's very interesting how the Chinese government taking care of this debt. Next, there's questions from colleagues from the Ministry of Trade of Indonesia going for Jayati. It's mentioning that you've been always in the front runner for TRIPS waiver for debt restructurings for developing countries. What will be your advice to G20 leaders and ministers as Indonesia currently holding presidency? Please, Jayati.
Well, multilateralism is really not doing its job at the moment. I think we can all agree on that. That we are facing global challenges. We are facing spillover effects of what one economy does on many others, like the US interest rates, for example. We are facing huge climate concerns occurring all over the world. And, we've just had a pandemic, which clearly didn't respect visas and passports and so on. So we have to think multilaterally, but it's not happening. The existing institutions are too slow to respond. The IMF and the World Bank have really not been able to deal with the debt crisis with the urgency and the speed that is required, or even to the extent that it is required. And so G20 has a huge role to play. Unfortunately, G20 also has really not delivered on its, shall we say, self-declared assumption of being the leaders of the world. It really hasn't delivered in terms of what it could do even in this period. I think the peak moment was really April 2009 after the global financial crisis, when they did respond in a coordinated manner. But now there is so much that can be done. We obviously must provide much more liquidity to a whole range of countries, not just those that are currently in debt crisis or about to fall into crisis, but many others who need money for dealing with their climate risks, for example, the loss and damage, the adaptations required, and many others who are facing the outcome of US tightening, so that they are facing major outflows of capital. So a significant increase, once again, a $650 billion increase in SDRs, I think it's obvious, because 104 countries have already used SDRs. They've used up 90% of that new allocation. And this is a costless thing. It really doesn't impact the global economy. It doesn't cost developed countries anything. So that's one immediate measure. Certainly the countries that received these SDRs, $400 billion went to rich countries that are never going to use this, should be considering recycling this much more than has happened. It's a tiny minority. I think only about 10 countries have gone in for any kind of redirection of their SDRs. The IMF's Resilience and Sustainability Trust has received only $40 billion, which is nothing. It's not even peanuts. Climate finance, the promised $100 billion has not been provided. There is so many ways in which these SDRs that are not being used could be used, and the fiscal cost is minimal. All it costs is, less than 1%, at 0.8%, I think currently is the interest rate on converting your SDRs into dollars or any other currency. We need debt cancellation. This could also be done using the SDRs. We need significant reform of the global tax system. The OECD took these measures. It agreed in principle that you can start taxing multinationals in the same way that you tax domestic companies, as one company, in other words, with this formulary apportionment of the tax revenues to all the different countries that they operate in. It recognized the need for a minimum global tax. But both those proposals were so watered down that they have amounted to almost no benefits for developing countries. Now more than ever, developing countries have to get fiscal space. And it can only be delivered multilaterally because of the way the global economy has happened. I mean, otherwise we're going to encourage more fragmentation. We will encourage countries to put up barriers on capital flow. We will encourage more regional moves because there is no option left for developing countries. So it is crucial for G20 to step up and actually respond to this because it's the only available agency today that can work multilaterally. And so it's very, very important to do these very simple measures that are available. And not even going into the vaccine inequity, which shows the failure of other multilateral institutions like the WTO. But, if we don't do this now, then across the world, countries, governments, people will lose faith in multilateral institutions. And that can only lead to very, very disturbing outcomes.
Yes, we totally agree with you. G20 is one of the most effective platforms in monetary and other sectors. So we have a couple of cabinet ministers here today. So we really hope Indonesia could come up with something very good, not only for G20 countries, but for the world. We received so many questions from Pak Khatib Basris, and many of the questions, as the former of finance minister, how reliable you see the current budget plan of Indonesia? How about the assumptions and the targets? Please, Pak Khatib.
This is a tough question because this is not an easy time for finance minister. As I said to you earlier, Lily, that we would expect that maybe there will be a sort of like a slowdown of the government revenue due to the declining of the palm oil prices, for example, and also some other commodities. But at the same time, we set the budget deficit to be less than 3% next year. So my take on this is perhaps it is very important to ensure that the quality of spending is there. Yeah, to allocate the budget on the most priority sector. Whereas in my view, one of the most important issues need to be taken into account is the impact of the high food crisis, high food prices to the vulnerable groups. So that is why the issue of this social protection is one of the most important priorities. The second one, I appreciate what the government did 2 months ago by adjusting the fuel price, because I think it is better to allocate the subsidy, targeted one, to the vulnerable groups rather than giving a subsidy to the middle and upper income group. That was the right decision, even though it's not politically easy. The third part is to focus the budget on the sector that have the higher multiplier, because again, our fiscal is relatively stretched. Yeah, so we have to make sure that the budget, the quality of spending is there. And last but not least, I do understand this is easier to be said than done. Somehow we need to do a reform on tax, on the administrative rather than rate. Because if you're raising the tax rate, it's gonna hit the economy. But there is room actually to do the administrative reform, for example, by moving the regular tax office into medium tax office who have a better service capacity in order to improve the quality. I've done one of research with Rimahana from Harvard and Ben Olken from MIT about this, and it can create a sort of like additional substantial revenue if the government do the administrative reform. So with this kind of things, perhaps we can sort of like, not a perfect situation, we are not living in the first best world, yeah, but at least we can mitigate the impact and make sure that our fiscal in the proper shape. Thank you.
Thank you, Khatib. I received so many interesting questions, but unfortunately that we have to finish these sessions. Let us invite each speakers to give concluding remark 1 minute for each, starting from Ken, Justin, Jayati, and Katib. Please, Ken.
Okay, thank you. I hope you can hear me now. Thank you for this excellent session and these great comments from my fellow panelists. We face a very difficult period going forward. I just have to repeat that at the outset. And I think even when it's over, there are going to be challenges, particularly for fiscal authorities, because I don't think interest rates, having gone up, are going to come down as fast as you might hope when inflation comes down. I think the era of the free lunch is over. We should have expected it to be over, and it's going to affect markets, it's going to affect investment, and it certainly is I think the big challenge of the next 10 years is adjusting to that new reality. Thank you.
Thank you, Ken. Please, Justin.
Well, it's a great honor for me to join this panel and with such a distinguished group of panelists, and especially in a very challenging time in the world. And certainly, we should pay attention to the challenges and find a way to cope with that. But at the same time, I would also like to say, growth is the foundation for coping with any challenges. And so every country at any time, I think there's always opportunity for growth. And we need to identify those kind of opportunities and mobilize our resources and our measures to tap into that growth potential, to turn that into as realities. And if we have this approach, I think we can handle the challenges and maintain reasonable growth to weather through it. Thank you.
Thank you, Justin. Please, Jayati.
Thank you so much. It was such a privilege to be with these absolutely brilliant and eminent experts. I just want to emphasize that, it's not just that we're facing these challenges, but 80% of the world's population is already living under fiscal austerity. In other words, public spending is actually being cut, particularly in the issues that were just mentioned, like social protection and so on. And that is adding to the terrifically detrimental effects that we are facing. So more than ever, we have to have some kind of multilateralism. We have to have some re-emergence of international solidarity. Instead, we're getting short-term nationalistic responses, conflictual responses, which are only making things worse. Somewhere we have to find in us the recognition that we have to cooperate. Species that don't cooperate don't survive. Actually, not just biologically. I mean, this is the case. So we really have to find the urge for some kind of cooperation to get us out of this, because otherwise the challenges we face as humanity are simply not going to be met. And therefore, it doesn't even matter whether we can get growth this year or next year or in 3 years from now. What matters is that we have to survive as a species, and the planet has to survive. And for that, we have to find the global cooperation.
Thank you, Jayati, for highlighting the very importance of global cooperations to cope these world challenges. Please, Pak Hatip.
Well, thank you very much. Thanks for having me, Lily. It is very honor to share the stage with the great lineup of speakers today. I just want to emphasize, to highlight about the implication to the Indonesian economy. We heard from all the other speakers about, the very challenging situation about the global impact with the rising interest rate, the energy prices, the food prices, etc. But I would say that even though there is a risk that the Indonesian economy may slow down, but I don't think we will enter the economic recession. Yeah, but it doesn't mean that there is room for us to be sort of like, it's not the good time to do the relaxation. I can imagine the Minister of State-owned Enterprise, Pa Eric, is here. Must be a very tough time for him. He cannot take the vacation during this time because we need to prepare, because there is no room for us to make a mistake, because the budget is very stretched, the policy option is limited. But I do believe that even the slowdown, Indonesia will not enter the recession. We are relatively stands out compared to many countries in the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Very encouraging statement indeed. If we may conclude discussions, though the Indonesian's economy is doing relatively well compared to other developing countries, but please keep in mind, one, we don't have any privilege of fiscal. Our tax revenue to GDP is only between 8 to 9%, while developed countries have the privilege of about 25%. Second, we have a very good prudent fiscal policy. Our ratio of fiscal deficit to GDP is limited to 3%, strict by law. We relaxed only 6% last year due to the pandemic, but next year we're gonna aim for 2.8%. The third point, that's partly of the good luck, it's coming from the increases in the commodities prices, particularly palm oil and coal. That's something we need to keep in mind. For the last 3 years, Indonesia recorded trade surpluses of 16.23, of 16.32, 44 billion US dollar respectively. But please keep in mind that actually the volume exports decrease. It's decreased by 50 million tons, 160 million tons. And investments, capital outflows recording 50 billion US dollar just in the first semester of this year in developing countries. So with that, stay healthy, keep positive, keep optimistic. We wish all the best to all businesses and government officials, academics joining us today. Let's give a big round of applause to our incredible speakers and to all participants. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much, Ms. Lily Yang In, and all the respectable speakers, and also the panelists for joining us virtually. Once again, ladies and gentlemen, please give a big round of applause for this insightful discussion.